it's often the case that I run into people saying that writing is both a wonderful thing. So it's kind of like being in heaven. You're going through the flow of things. Everything is clicking together. And at the same time, writing is painful. I actually ran into a post where someone was saying, oh, writing is one thing that I love doing, but at the same time, it's like pulling out your teeth. I actually don't follow that sentiment. I think it's often the case that people who write have big troubles getting started when they write. They have trouble writing that first draft. They have trouble with the errors that fill it up, and they often lament that what they write is a horrible thing. And I know that I've lamented the fact that what I write is a horrible thing. But I do it in more of a humorous way than most people. I actually don't have trouble writing first drafts like some people. I don't have trouble at all because I don't really care how I write first drafts. That's because I embrace the suck of writing first drafts, and I think you should too. My name is Daniel Poppy, and this is How to Write Good. Welcome to How to Write Good, the writing podcast that is not about how to write. My name is Daniel Poppy, your host. You can find out more about me at danielpoppy.com. If you haven't already, please follow How to Write Good on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook. If you would like to stay up to date with both How to Write Good and everything I am working on, please sign up for my email list. You can find that at my website as well. Again, that's danielpoppy.com. All right, as well, check out One Last Toast. I've already gone over it. The fourth chapter is out. There were two last month. The fourth chapter is out, so check that out. Again, I'm just going to clarify how I put those out and kind of my timeline for doing that. I put them out one Sunday after there is a whole week in a month, if that makes sense. So if you look at the month, there is a whole week, and then the Sunday at the after that week is when I put it out on online, so you can find it on the stream. It has its own stream if you don't like listening to me here, but you can listen to me there as well. The word of the week is piquant. It means having a sharp taste or a good flavor. It also means stimulating to the mind or exciting to the mind. So it's related to the word pique, Pique, so it's spelled that way, piquant. I believe I said it the correct way right here. I looked it up before, don't worry. We're going to jump into our accidental lessons right away. We are going on to rule number 13. This is the second to last rule for writing. People seem to like these. I don't know why. Maybe there's some value in them. Maybe it's because honestly, if I were writing a book and I were writing specific rules for writing, these 14 that I've come up with are what I would have in the book, or essentially what I would have in the book. And the further I get away, the further I would get away from the first rule, so the lower the rule is in the rank order, the less likely I would have it in a book. But if I were writing a book about writing, I would have, hey, these are the rules, the guidelines I would say to have on your mind when you're writing about something, and have the bigger the ones with the lower numbers on your mind more than the others. This one's fun. I don't really know how long it's going to take to talk about this one, but this one's fun because this one gets rid of a lot of frustration with writing. At least I think it gets rid of a lot of frustration that people have with writing. Now, this rule is enjoy writing bad drafts. Specifically, enjoy writing bad first drafts, but I think it's easier to say. It sounds better when you just say enjoy writing bad drafts. You cannot write well. Now, a lot of people can't write well without getting frustrated, as I said at the beginning of this podcast. The reason why you can't write well, so if you're someone, let's go back a second. If you're someone who writes and you sit down at a computer, or I like writing longhand, so I write with a pen. If you are someone who writes and you sit down at a computer and you stare at that blank screen and you think, man, I have no idea what to write. One of the issues that you have no idea what to write is because you actually do have something to write, first of all. You sit down, you want to have perfect prose when you put it on the computer or when you write it down on the page. And when you sit down, you think, and you're like, well, I don't have perfect prose in my head. And therefore, you think you don't have anything to write. But there are thoughts going on inside of your head for most of us, for people who write. A lot of what you think is verbal, right? I would say that if you're a big writer, if you're someone who is drawn toward that medium, a lot of what you do is verbal when you write. Now, when you sit down, there's thoughts going through your head. First of all, there is a thought, I don't know what to write, going through your head. Or you think, oh man, I'm really frustrated. This kind of sucks because I just have writer's block. Well, if you have something going through your head, you have something to write. It may not be what you want. That's the issue. It may not be what you want, but it is something going through your head. But the issue with this is people want perfection right away. They want to sit down at a computer, they want to be able to write, and they want to be able to do it really well. I think this is a form of impatience and laziness, actually. First, impatient, and they go together. Impatience and laziness often go together. And I'm not trying to call anybody out, but maybe you should look at yourself and be like, hey, is this the reason why I can't do this? And also perfectionism on top of it. But I think that it comes together to maybe even create this idea of, oh, I feel I'm such a perfectionist, I can't get anywhere. But you may be a perfectionist. But before you say, I'm such a perfectionist, therefore I'm never going to be able to write a book, maybe you should ask yourself, am I lazy? Maybe you should ask yourself, do I have the patience to write a book? Because, or am I willing to put in enough hours to actually write the book? Because if you are writing and you have an endless amount of time to write, it really doesn't matter how long it takes, just as long as you get to that end result, right? If you have an infinite amount of time, and this seems like I'm going off track here, but when you sit down to write, for me, I want that book finished yesterday, right? And I'm sure a lot of people do as well. They sit down to write, they want that book finished yesterday, they want a finished product, they want something really good, they have this image in their mind, and I've heard it, I've seen writers lament the fact that they didn't have something that could take the thoughts out of their brain and put them on the paper. Well, you do. First of all, you do have something that can take the thoughts out of your brain and put them onto the paper. It's called your hand. So, but they want computer software that can read their mind and essentially spit stuff out on the paper without doing them any work. That's lazy, okay? But what happens is you sit down and you want something perfect. Well, you can get something very close to perfect, or possibly, right, if you take the time to actually put in the work to get it there, right? But when you sit down, you want it immediately, and what you just need to do is be like, oh, what's going on in my head? And you just need to write what's going on in your head. And I think I've talked about this before, but I think this is so important because so many people lament it. And it's something that I don't see professional writers complaining about. Actually, I think professional writers, and I would say that I'm not a professional writer because I don't do writing full time. Okay, I know that I'm not trying to say this about me, but I'm just clarifying. You can be just as good as someone who writes full time and not make money off of what you're writing. I think if you're writing full time, you have a lot more practice and a lot more time to refine your skill. Therefore, you're probably better if you're writing full time, but it's not necessarily the case. Okay. But what people who do this as a living say is, hey, like, it's not about, you are a writer, therefore you need to write. And in the past, I talked about this idea that, hey, if you write, you're a writer. Okay. You may not be a professional writer, but if you write, you're a writer. Even if that's once a week, even if that is a couple times a week, if it is a habitual part of your life, you are a writer. But at the same time, when you approach writing, you need to approach it, you need to change how you're thinking about it. Most people just want that perfection. Most people don't want to put in the work. Another thing I've talked about in the past is that people, when you want to get rid of writer's block, set a specific amount of time and write for that time. And then you slowly increase that amount of time, because part of the reason why you're getting writer's block is because you are too impatient and you want to pump out a book in 24 hours. And you can't pump out a book in 24 hours. There is a author, I can't remember who the author was, and he talks about this idea how more books are written in 15-minute or 30-minute stints than getting them done in this really short amount of time and just binging on writing. Writing is different than, I think, other forms of art. Writing is different certainly than music. I think writers are different than musicians, definitely. I think that writing is different than acting, certainly, of course it is. And actors are different than writers, and they're different than painters. Now, musicians can write an album in a week, okay? Musicians can write an album in a week. It's possible to do that. maybe, and there are musicians that I know of, even classical musicians, who wrote pieces of music in a very short amount of time. Well, when you're writing a piece of music, first of all, you're dealing with a lot smaller bit of information. The information, the stuff that you're trying to put out is shorter than a writer. An actor, they're different than writers because they also can kind of like go on this, they also can binge on things, they can dive into things, and it's not going to affect their craft as much. Maybe it'll actually help their craft because they're going out on a limb. But writers, I think, have to take it a little bit slower than other types of art. I actually think that there's a lot more, I think it is a lot more logical than other types of art. I think it is a type of art that it requires a lot more thinking. Typically, you can't bluff your way through it. First of all, you can't use 5 chords and play those 5 chords over and over again and create a hit song. You actually have to put the time in. You actually have to write a book that, hey, has about 50,000, 75,000, 100,000 words, and you have to refine that so people can actually understand it. The thing about music that's cool is you can actually kind of make noise, and you have a lot. I don't know if you necessarily have a lot more flexibility, but the bar, I think, for music is actually lower than for writing because people don't have to completely understand what you're trying to mean through the music. People have to completely understand or almost completely understand what you're going through for writing. So let's go back to writing first drafts. I think people approach writing first drafts in 2 different ways. There's the non-planners who figure out writing as they're telling the story, and there's the planners who hash out the details before they actually start writing. Now, if you're someone who has writer's block and you're a person who says, well, I need to just write things as they come to me, I would suggest that you try planning something out. Even if it's 1 page and it has the different pieces of the book or whatever you're trying to write, even if it has a very brief sketch of what the story is going to be, I would suggest just trying to plan and see if that helps. Because sometimes it's the case that when you're writing and you get writer's block, and I know that I'm going off on a writer's block tangent right now, excuse me, when you write and you try to get writer's block, it means that you don't actually know what you're trying to write or where you're trying to get. If you know where you're trying to get, it's going to be easier to get there. That makes sense, right? And then there's the other people who already plan, okay? But writing a book, no matter what, is a process. It's something that takes, I think that you could write a book in a month. I think that a first draft in a month. I think that if you had the resources that you actually could publish in a month as well. I am actually convinced that if you have the resources, you could publish in a month. I would love to be able to do that at some point and just try to challenge myself and do it. But writing a book is a process. If you want to sit down and write a first draft in a month, but most people take about 3 to 6 months probably to write a first draft, unless you're a professional writer, but that's a little bit different, okay? Most people don't have the time to put tons of time into their writing in huge chunks. On top of that, it also takes a few times over before you actually have something you want to show someone. A lot of things in life are like this. I think a lot of things are actually this way. So in our lives, and I think throughout history, people, I think it actually was more in the past of the United States specifically. I don't know about other time periods or other countries. But I think in the arts of the United States, there came to be this idea that someone was able to create something out of nowhere. So they were just a genius, so they were able to create these amazing pieces of art, and they never had to work for it. I think that this actually leads to a false idea about an artist and artists in general. People have this idea that if someone was an amazing artist and they put out these iconic pieces of art, that all their artwork was really, really good. So you look back and you see these pieces of art throughout their entire life, and you think they're they're exactly the same. They're exactly on the same level of value or quality as their later works or when they were a better artist. But most people don't realize that to get good at anything, you actually have to take time to get good at things. And I think that that's actually shifting to a certain degree, but I still think there's this sense that, hey, if you are good at something, you are good at something. I think in schools, this is actually shifting. So I think my generation wasn't told this, but I think generations that are younger are told this. generally in school. I think they're told that learning things and getting better at things is a process rather than something that you're either good at or bad. Instead of focusing on talent, there's a focus on becoming good at something. There's a focus on hard work. There's a focus on developing a skill. I have a friend, haven't talked to her in a while, but she probably still plays several different instruments, and she went to school. I think one of her degrees was in music, and people would always say, "Oh, you're so talented in music," and she would say, "Hey, I spent hour upon hour upon hour practicing this instrument so I could play it this specific way." Don't think people realize what goes into something. People devalue art because of this as well. If you look at a painting, you may think, "Oh, well, that," or if you run into someone who's really good at painting, maybe they're able to paint something in an hour or two, right? Maybe they're able to paint something in half an hour. They're just that good. They can paint it in a half an hour. They can see what's going on. They know what they need to do, where they need to put highlights, etc. And they create this amazing piece of art. And you say, well, they only took an hour to paint it. Therefore, it should be worth this amount of money. But you don't see all the time it actually took to develop that skill. I think that if you have a good skill, if you have a very high skill in something, if you have a skill that requires a lot of time, I think that skill, you should be paid more for that skill, even if it is something superfluous in society, which some people might think art is superfluous. So, to a certain degree it is. If you have to choose art or eating, you're going to choose eating, right? But realize that pretty much everybody who became really good at something was at some point really bad at something. Do you think people come out of the womb being able to paint beautiful pictures or being able to sculpt lifelike figures? Do you think people come out of the womb being able to act like Christian Bale? I think Christian Bale is a very good actor. That's why I posit him as an example right here. Did I use posit in that way correctly? But I think that this idea of people being super talented, hyper talented, people being good at everything, maybe there are people who just can pick up anything they want, but I think that this idea that that's how it works, I think it stops people from getting stuff done. I think it stops people from... I think it stops writers, people who want to be writers or people who are amateur writers. Let's just say we're all amateur writers, right? Probably. I think it stops them from actually getting a first draft of a book done. And I think that the first draft, they don't get it done because they want it to be a specific way. They want it to be perfect. First of all, you're never going to have a book that's perfect. There's always going to be things in a book that are not going to be perfect. But you're almost certainly, because you may end up with a draft of a book that's amazing, right? You may become the best writer that has ever existed in any language of all time, and you may be able to someday write a book in one go and not have to do anything else with that book except send it off to a copywriter or something like that. But I would bet that you're not going to be able to do that. And the issue is that people want that finished product right away. They don't realize that it's never going to turn out the way they want it to. It's never going to be the way they want it to, even after you go through the edits and figure out stuff, right? You don't get the thing you set out to try to get, and especially in first drafts. When you write first drafts, you need to embrace what comes to your mind. Have fun with it, seriously. If you have a weird idea, why not try to incorporate it? And you can always trash it later, right? This is why I'm a fan of having a plan, because if you have a plan for a book, you know where the book is going. You know if that crazy idea is going to work in the book, or you know how to incorporate that crazy idea into the book, right? For example, if you write a book about a conspiracy in the government, and you're like, hey, I want to put aliens in the book. Well, you put aliens in one section of the book on a whim, and you know where it's going to go in the end. And what that does is, in your mind when you're writing the book, and you know where it's going to go in the end, it creates a specific structure of what's feeding into that climax of the book, right? It creates a specific structure that you have to follow. And even if you want to take those out, it's going to leave a gap in that structure that you can fill with something else and make it make more sense, if that makes sense. There's a specific flow to writing. There's a specific flow to storytelling. And if you know where you're going, you can pull things out of that flow and plug in different things. That's what I'm trying to say. Rough drafts, I think, are for having fun. So I think you should be indulgent when you write your first drafts. And other writers say this as well. And I think this is a good thing that they say. I think that when you write first drafts, you should be completely indulgent. This should be the really, really fun part of writing. If something comes to your mind, stick it in. If you have a specific dialogue that you think is great, and you're like, oh, this is so fun to write this dialogue, have fun with the dialogue. If you have inside jokes with your friends, stick the inside jokes with your friends in. Just have fun with it. All ideas are on the table if they can fit into that story. And I think that's really how you should address it. Because first of all, the first draft is going to be awful, right? The first draft is going to have tons of errors. There's going to be places, and this happens to me too, there's going to be places in that first draft where you just think, man, I can't believe I wrote this. This is so stinking awful. This is so boring. I should never write again. This is so stupid, right? When you, I actually have, when I write a first draft, I do not look back at that first draft until I'm done with it, because I know I'm going to get too discouraged. But at the same time, when I'm writing those specific chunks of the first draft, I generally have a bit of fun with it. I just let myself go. But there's definitely going to be times where you look back, you're like, man, this is terrible. But at the same time, when you're writing the first draft, you do not need to do that. Edits are completely different. Edits are horrible. Editing a book is bad. Editing a book stinks. It's really discouraging because you get to look at all your errors and you get to say, how do I make this book work? How do I make this book into something that actually is good instead of something that is just me writing? Now the question is there a deeper philosophical reason behind why we should write bad drafts? Now, one of the reasons, and I've already said this before, this isn't necessarily philosophical, but these are some ideas of why I think you should write bad drafts. Some are more philosophical than others. That's what I meant to say. Ideas that would not come to your mind. So let me rephrase that. There's ideas that come to your mind because you know it's going to be crappy that would have not come to your mind otherwise, right? You're willing to try new things out. I think you need to be willing to risk stuff. Think you need to be willing to try things out, to put things in your book that maybe you aren't sure about, right? It frees your mind to do what the story needs. In some cases, you need to shift your story. So you started out with the story, you had a specific plan, you have something happen in the story. And because that thing happens in the story, logically, you should be reacting to that thing in your writing. And there's a lot of different ways you can react to it, but you need to have it make sense, right? And I think that by allowing yourself to write a crappy draft, it allows you to free up what you do in reaction to those things. Because if you think, oh, well, I could have a nuclear blast happen in the story, and you think, oh, that kind of doesn't make sense. Because that's kind of out there. I don't know if I should, but you're like, well, I'm just going to put it in and see what happens with it. See, it's taking chances. It's trying new things out. Again, stories follow a logic apart from the storyteller. People say that they follow their own story. So what happens? I don't think this is correct at all. It doesn't make sense, first of all. But there is a piece of truth in it, so let me try to explain. So I've heard big writers say that, hey, they don't write their stories write themselves. That isn't true. The writer writes the stories. The writer's the one making stuff. Now, at the same time, the stories have a specific structure. Stories have a specific logic to them. If something happens in the story, as I was saying, there needs to be a reaction or something else happening. For example, if I put a character in a really hard situation, storytelling logic tells me that I need to have that character struggle against that situation or struggle against something. I need that character to have a goal, right? If a character has pain, I need that character to react to that pain. So there's a lot of different things that go into a story. There's a lot of different things that connect, that make up this story logic, and I think that's what writers are actually trying to convey. They are the ones that are writing it, but they need to follow a specific logic. Let's actually break that idea of logic down a little bit further, okay? So you've got, let's just say you write a book, it's 75,000 words. And if you, actually let's go with 150 because I already have the numbers here. Now that story, 150,000 word story, which is a big book. It's a larger book. It's not huge. There's bigger books definitely. But 150,000 words all need to hang together in a story. Okay? In that story, you have about 30,000 sentences. Roughly. or let me see, is it 30,000 sentences? And you have about 6,000 paragraphs. Well, each of your paragraph has to contain not a thought, right? It's a thought cloud, essentially. Each paragraph contains a thought that's complete. But each of those paragraphs have to connect to another paragraph. And then all of those paragraphs together have to show a character change. So there's an emotional reaction in the reader. And that's what I mean by the logic of the story. So there's all these little tiny pieces, and they all have to fit together in a specific way so that people react to that story. Because if you have a story that people don't react to in some way, that doesn't change the character, that doesn't affect a person's emotion, that person isn't going to like the story as much. It takes a lot of time to get all those little pieces working together. You have a lot of flexibility to get all those little pieces working together. But at the same time, you are restricted by storytelling rules, right? If you never have a character change, if a character's deadpan, people complain about specific characters being too powerful. So they say, oh, characters are too powerful, therefore there's no possibility, or this character is too perfect, therefore there's no possibility for change in this character, therefore this character is boring, which is true. If there's no possibility for a character changing, the character is boring. This actually happens in video games too as well. It's called breaking a game, if you don't know video games. So if you are in a fighting game, there's games where you fight against different people in the game. Super Smash Bros. Is one of them. I think it's probably the most famous one. Or you have stuff like Mortal Kombat. But if there's a game, when I was a kid, we played Super Nintendo, and we played Street Fighter, I believe. I think it was Street Fighter. It's Street Fighter. And then there was one move you could use in the game where you kept on kicking low. And what it would do is it would trip somebody, and we didn't think it would allow you to react. So we always told each other, hey, you aren't allowed to do that because it's cheating, because it's too easy to win the game. Well, what happens in newer games is you can actually do certain things in the game that make the game extremely easy. And what that is called in gaming today is breaking the game, right? You figure out a way to game the system that's been created in the game that makes it extremely easy. And because there's no challenge left in that game, then it's a boring game. Games that have no challenge are not fun games. If you play against someone in tennis and you always lose, you're going to get bored because you're like, well, I always lose. It never matters. There's no competition in this game. And if they always win, they're going to get bored too. They're not going to like playing with you because there's no competition. There's no challenge. People like challenge. And at the same time, there's a sense of challenge in a story. There's a sense of change in a story. There's ideas that butt up against one another. There's friction in the story that helps make that story interesting. Now the question is, how does this relate back to writing bad drafts for a writer, right? Lots of rights there. So with writing bad drafts, what I said at the beginning of this section is that people get really impatient with writing. They want something perfect, and they also want that perfect thing yesterday, okay? Impatience is you need to become patient when you're writing something. First of all, the majority of people are not expert writers. The majority of people aren't these phenomenal writers, and the majority of people are probably middling writers. I would say I'm not an expert writer either. I'm someone who has been writing a long while, but at the same time, I'm not one of the best writers in the world. I'm not on the top for writing. I'm just someone who really, really likes writing, and I would love to be at some point, but you're not going to be perfect. You're not going to be perfect. One thing I said 2 weeks ago when I had the band Eden on is one thing I would tell kids to do, or somebody to do right away, is I would tell them to publish. I would tell them to publish as soon as possible, even if it's something crappy. Because then what it does is it says, hey, I can put stuff out even if it's not perfect. I can put something out even if it's not perfect. It can be fun, it can be entertaining, but if it's not perfect, I'll still try. Because people who make films put stuff out when they're younger, and it's not very good, right? They have to develop that skill. Writing, you have to take a lot of different ideas and put them together in writing. What this does for you, or what I think it does for you, is it shows you, hey, I don't have to be perfect. I can slow down. I can be patient with this. I can have fun with it. I think it's really necessary when you're writing to actually have fun when you're writing. And one way you can have fun is by getting rid of your expectations for that first draft. Because it's not going to be a good first draft anyway. It's not going to be it's not going to be something complete. You're going to have to go over it several more times before it's good enough to put out and let people read it. But it's something that you can have a lot of fun with it. Right? If you take your time, you're going to probably have too much material to work with. But at the same time, you are going to have more fun when you're writing it. You can put different thoughts, different feelings of different characters in. Slow down, be patient, take your time, do what you need to do in the story. That's also going to make your story more interesting. If you have fun with it, if you slow down, you're going to explore different things with the characters. Some ways you explore are going to be as boring as... They're going to be really boring, let's just say that. Some ways you explore the character are going to be really boring, and you're probably going to hit on stuff where you're like, wow, I wrote this. If you are impatient, you're going to be jumping from one thing to another, and you aren't going to explain stuff. You're not going to take the time to create a vignette and let people actually experience the world or experience the story. One thing, I actually read a book. I didn't read the book, but I took some snippets of it, and I was just, because what I do when I want to know if a story is good is I quick flip it open, or writing is good as I flip it open, I read chunks of it. I read like a paragraph here or a paragraph there. And what this person was doing goes back to a very fundamental thing that a lot of people say when they tell you how to write well. So what she did is she just explained what was going on. She didn't actually paint a picture of what was going on. It was just telling you what was going on. It's like, oh, they did this, and then they did that, and then they did this, etc., and so on. That is something that we say we're telling rather than showing. And when you're a writer, a lot of people say, hey, instead of telling people something, show them what's going on. I don't know if show works the best in this situation to describe what you're actually doing, but I know what it means. It means that you're actually supposed to take your time. You're supposed to slow down enough to paint a picture of what's going on. It might be a description of something that you're painting a picture of. It might be dialogue between two characters. But if you are only focused on the end goal, and you must get to that end goal as soon as possible, you are going to have writing that isn't as good than if you actually took the time to make the start of the dialogue. Let's just say it's dialogue you're talking about. So you have a specific end goal that you want to get to for the dialogue. Well, you are starting in a specific space, right? For example, if you have two characters, if you have a romance, and you have characters who hate each other, and you want them to fall in love with each other, or maybe there's a lot of tension, right? They don't want to deal with each other, they want to leave each other. Well, if you have characters who want to leave each other, and you have a dialogue, and the end goal of that is that they're staying together, if you don't take your time, what's going to happen is you're going to jump straight into them staying together and making up, right? And it's not going to be as satisfying because you actually didn't do the work to get there. You didn't do the work to get there. You jumped from, oh, we actually want to break up to we want to stay together. And it doesn't make sense. It doesn't make logical sense because there's a process that goes on in the characters. There's a process that goes on in the scene. There's a process that goes on before you can go from, hey, we're going to break up to, hey, we actually love each other. We're going to stay together. That was actually a good example. So remember that. So actually take your time in all the things you're writing. You have specific goals in writing. People realize that. But when you have those specific goals, you can't just jump from, hey, here we are, we're at the goal. Otherwise, books would be a lot shorter and books would be a lot worse. They would have never caught on if they were like that. Let's be honest. So the logical fallacy of the week. So for logical fallacies, I've run out of them. So I'm going to be repeating some of them that I think are especially good, and maybe I'll switch it up and I'll do something else for the end of the podcast later on. But the logical fallacy of the week is special pleading. All right. So what this is you're citing something as an exception to a generally accepted rule without justifying the exception. I guess this logical fallacy actually connects back to what I talked about today. Enjoy writing first drafts. Enjoy writing first drafts so you can justify what happens in your story by being patient and taking the time to actually write out what you need to write out. In the same way, when you're arguing logically, you need to actually justify what you are arguing before you say it's correct or incorrect. if you enjoy this podcast and would like to support me more, what I would ask you to do is that you go to iTunes and you leave a 5-star review. That is something that really, really helps me and helps push the podcast out to different people. And it's something that doesn't cost you much time at all. So if you would do that, I would really appreciate that. And I definitely appreciate everyone who listens to this podcast. If you ever listen to this podcast and you have questions or you have topics you would like me to cover, you can send those to me and I'll look them over and I'll see which ones I think I can cover intelligently. And if you just want to reach out for anything at all, you can do that as well. Thanks for your time. My name is Daniel Poppy, and as always, this is How to Write Good.